We're recording this, aren't we? But you've got AI interpreting my words, I noticed.
Yes, I can turn that off if you prefer.
Oh, that's okay. We're recording this, aren't we? But
yes, it's been recorded straight
AI
onto YouTube.
interpreting my words, I noticed. Now we have a different voice.
That was because I had Zoom open. I'm going to open the waiting room. Stephen's going to introduce you.
Yep.
So let me admit all. That's what we do. Close waiting room.
So it's starting at 7, isn't it?
Yes.
It's climbing.
Good evening, Jamal. Good evening. Can't see who else is here. Let's see if I can see who's here. Rob, Doris.
Hi.
Oh, lots of people. Andy and Claire, Joe, Steve, Anthony. That looks like it at the moment, but Anne, Pat. Oh, we've got people coming in.
Yes, there's some names I know there. Hello to the people in Lancashire.
Evening.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Diane.
You have some background music or something happening.
I can hum if you want.
Wonder if it's worth thinking about putting some background music in.
We might look at that for the next one.
Some silence and everybody wonders whether the technology is working or not.
Yep.
Well, I quite often ask people what the weather's doing because everyone's all over the place. So you get to sort of have a forecast of what's actually happened today. But it's been so depressing the last couple of weeks. I daren't ask. Has it snowed with you? Is not what I want to be asking.
The bees have been reacting to it, haven't they? I was looking through my hives earlier, and they're much weaker than they should be.
Yeah.
Because they haven't had any food.
I think it's probably the worst June gap I've experienced,
Hmm.
certainly in the last 10 years.
Well, driving around locally, there's been absolutely masses of forage, oxide daisies in road verges and all sorts of stuff. But they just haven't been able to get out to it. And presumably, because it's been cold, wet, hasn't been much nectar if they've been getting out to it. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's about 14 degrees here today, which is, I mean, it's not cold, but it felt cold as it's gone the middle of June.
Yep. It's Midsummer Day tomorrow, isn't it? Longest day.
Oh, that's cheery. It'll be Christmas soon. Unfortunately.
Carols.
Yeah.
Soon be, on that cheery note of it soon being Christmas, it's 7 o'clock. I'm going to introduce Andy Pedley, who's going to talk to us about food safety for the beekeeper. I heard Andy speak at the Spring Convention in 2023. I came away from the discussion and his presentation a much wiser man, but I suspect you'll all do the same, but it will also bust a few myths, but pose a few questions, which I'm sure Andy will be happy to answer at the end of it. I also bought Andy's book, which I thoroughly recommend. Have you got? You're going to show us a copy there? Yeah. Something that if you're selling honey off the doorstep or in other ways, it's a book that you should have on your bookshelf. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Andy Pedley.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. So we start off with a picture of an ancient Egyptian beekeeper. His bees are quite a lot larger than mine. These are his hives. They still keep bees in horizontal hives in Egypt, apparently. And he's kneeling in front of his hives. And I just like this picture, but it links in with others I'll be using later on. The Egyptians saw honey as being the food of the tears of Ra, the tears of the sun god, which is wonderful. Now, I put this slide at the beginning because I have it at the end. When I put it at the end, I tend not to pay much attention to it. So there are a couple of points on it. First of all, if I'm talking about the law, only the courts can interpret the law. So what I'm saying, pay attention to, but I might well be wrong. There's case law comes along all the time. The fee for this evening is being donated to Bees for Development. And if you scan that QR code or make a note of that URL there, then you'll get a handbook, not a handbook, but a sort of handout will download for you from Google Documents. So that's hopefully a useful thing. And that will pop up again at the end. So I mentioned law, and we start off because producing food is a legal business. The law applies to everybody. If you produce food, then you have to comply with food safety legislation. It applies to the biggest supermarkets, Tesco, Safeways, Morrison's. It applies to your corner shop. It applies to the pub across the road. And it applies to beekeepers. We have to produce safe food. So it's the duty of a food business operator to ensure that all stages of our production, processing, and distribution under our control satisfy the relevant hygiene requirements. And so this talk is really aimed at telling you what the relevant hygiene requirements are. And I thought to myself, we probably ought to find out if we're food businesses or not. So a food business operator, there's a legal definition in EU legislation, and it's producing food that goes into the public supply. So whether it's production, processing, distribution, and it includes things like private schools, that kind of thing. The only exclusion is solely domestic excluded. So if you produce honey and you use it for yourself and you give it away to your friends as Christmas presents, then it's probably excluded. But that is such broad definition that if you put it into, say, a school fete, instead of school fete, or give it as a raffle or something like the raffle prize or something like that, then you could be seen as being a food business operator. So safety, what could affect the safety of your honey? We know safety is honey is a wonderfully safe product. It keeps for a very long time. It doesn't degrade particularly. There are changes that occur in it over time, and I will be dealing with those. But by and large, it's a very safe food. It's not like a piece of meat that if you leave out, it'll get flies on it and it will go rotten. It's not like a cheese sandwich that will go moldy. It's a really safe product. So what could affect the safety of your food, of your honey? And here we come back to my ancient Egyptians. The reason for this is because in that definition, the first definition thing, it talked about stages of production. And we think about what stages of production that we have in our honey processing. And this Egyptian picture, and you can see it's from 2445 BC or thereabouts. It shows us ancient Egyptians processing honey. So this is the row of hives. This chap here is taking a piece of honeycomb out and he's passing it to his mate here, who's holding it and squeezing it. And he's squeezing it over a nice broad container, and here's the equivalent of the honey extractor. This chap here is pouring something from a broad container into a tall, slim container. It looks like me very much to a ripening tank, and it's even got the double rim on the top. And I think they've got a piece of old loincloth and tied it across the top there as some strainer to get bits of wax out. We've lost this one. There is actually a picture of people pouring honey into jars elsewhere. And then this is the completed jar. The chap is putting the seal on, and this is his anti-tamper seal, and it really is an anti-tamper seal. And then honey jars on the shelf ready for sale. And the hieroglyphs above do actually mean hymning, filling, pressing, and sealing. And hymning, maybe we should be singing to our bees. If you think they're the tears of Ra, tears of the sun god, maybe you had an incantation as you processed your honey or took the honey off. So if we take those stages and turn them into a flow chart, we start off with the hive itself. We assemble our hives, we medicate and treat our bees, and we site and store and transport the honey or the equipment to where we're going to site it. We work at the hive. I was at my hives earlier today, checking the bees over, the usual checks. Have they got any honey? Have they got swarm cells? That kind of thing. And we work at them, and hopefully we get a honey crop. So our honey crop comes off. We move our supers. We move our supers from the apiary, probably to a vehicle, and that might involve a wheelbarrow or something like that. And then from the apiary, from the vehicle into our extraction facility. And then we extract. We might store it for a little while before we extract. And we run it, I certainly run it into buckets when I'm extracting. And I regard bucket storage as being fairly long term. So I keep the buckets somewhere safe, and then I might need to heat it to liquefy it. I've got honey in a honey tank, in a warming tank at the moment. Thinning because it's the dreaded oilseed rape, and it's crystallized within days of me extracting it. And then having liquefied it, I strain it. We go on to the next stage. So we put it in our ripening tank. Eventually we bottle it. We're going to label it. We're probably going to store it before it's for sale. We then transport it to sale and we sell it. Or you might take it to a local retailer. The local sweet shop is very obliging to me, and other people have taken it in the past as well. Probably many of you have got arrangements with local shops and local outlets. But go back to this one. If you pack it up in buckets and sell it at the bucket, that becomes a business-to-business sale, and you need to register. We'll talk a bit more about that later. So those are the stages, I think. So, have we missed a slide? Okay. So what could harm your honey? Well, I think when I do this as a lecture in a room with people or a workshop, I ask the question, I get people to answer the questions. So the first thing is water. If there's too much water in it, it's going to ferment. So we want to keep it as dry as we possibly can. Our veterinary medicines can spoil our honey. The smoke that we use could spoil the honey. We might use pesticides and preservatives on our hives. Can that get into the honey? Propolis, I'll tell a story at this point. I had a very good customer by the name of Charlie. Charlie came along every month and he bought 6 jars of honey from me, and money changed hands and I was happy and Charlie was happy. One month Charlie turned up and he didn't have money in his hands, he had jars of honey, and he had found brown specks inside his honey and he thought it was rust, and he thought that the honey was below standard, so he brought it back for me. It wasn't because propolis, I just hadn't strained the honey as thoroughly as I normally did. So that cost me a very valuable customer. That was quite sad. Debris and dirt, bits of wings and bits of leg and that kind of thing can spoil our honey. Things like wax moth feces. If you do cut comb or comb honey, if there's a few wax moth larvae or eggs in the package, and they hatch, they'll produce webbing and they'll produce feces, and that spoils it, very obviously. Other pests, rats, mice, ants, wasps, that kind of thing, robber bees. We all know that HMF builds up with heat. So warming our honey too much spoils it. Keeping it too long spoils it. Heavy metals can spoil it, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Air pollution. So when the Notre Dame fire occurred in Paris, 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, the lead roof on Notre Dame, part of it vaporized, the lead went into the air, and there was a plume. And the lead pollution could be picked up in honey, upwind. And then finally, allergens, not in honey, but I put them in because I deal with it. So the first stage of production, we're at the hive. How can we harm our honey? So I mentioned medicines. We must only ever use licensed medicines for our hives, for our bees. Veterinary medicines, use them in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Keep the obligatory records, which need to be kept in writing for 5 years. So you can show what you treated. That includes things like the batch number. And in the past, I've known people, myself included, using sort of do-it-yourself formulations, thymol in jelly paste, that kind of thing. And that isn't on. If there's a problem and you've not used an unlicensed product, you're going to have to answer some very difficult questions. Use licensed products, keep the records. And if there's a problem, you say, well, I used Apigard, I used it on such and such a day, here's the batch number. And if there's a problem because the honey is contaminated as a consequence of that, then you can go back to the manufacturer and you can be relaxed that you've done everything properly and the buck will be passed, to say the least. I usually mention smoke. We use smoke or other materials to calm our bees. You don't want to use anything that's got treated timber in it or any chemicals in it if you can avoid. Among other things, I don't want to be inhaling pesticides and so on. So I use either shavings or sawdust, or my preferred fuel is Hessian sacking. I find it works quite well, lights well, when you find some clean Hessian and use that, and that's good. So we've got this wonderful crop. Oh, I didn't mention the most obvious one of when you're working your bees, you put the supers down on an upturned roof or something to keep them off the ground. This is now a food product, and if you put it on the ground, it's going to get bits of dirt, stuff from the leaves, bits of leaf, goodness knows what in it. So very simple precaution. You turn your roof upside down, you pop the things down on that, and that keeps it off the ground and keeps it nice and clean. So at some point, you're going to move your honey, your supers, and it probably involves a vehicle. So here's our old Ford Mondeo with what I think was probably one of my best ever crops. And I was taking it off to get it extracted. So it's in the back of the car. I'd left it there overnight, which might not have been very bright, to be honest with you. You can see lots of condensation on the window. Fortunately, all that was all on the outside, but the moisture could have affected the honey. The the car is used for many things. It takes stuff to the dump. It sometimes we don't have a dog, but sometimes people take the dogs for walks, so there's mud, there's dog hair, and goodness knows what. And you're suddenly going to start using it for moving food around. So how do you manage that? And the simple answer is use something like a plastic sheet to line the bottom of the boot, something nice and clean. I heard somebody said they use a tarpaulin and they line it and then they put the supers down. And so the supers are protected from the car, and the car's protected from dripping honey and propolis and goodness knows what. And then when it's completed, they take the tarpaulin out and they put it in the washing machine, give it a clean. So they've always got something nice and clean. But you just need to be aware of that. And the number of times I've seen people, chuck supers in the backs of their cars, and I'm thinking, dog hair, eh? That's going to look good in the analysis. So you're going to come to some kind of place where you're going to extract your honey. Ideally, you're going to have a food room, but don't panic if you haven't got something like this. So we'll sort of work clockwise. Here is the door, and you bring the supers in here. And I put a tray on the floor, so they're kept off the floor. And I put a stack of supers about there. And then there's a work surface here. And so I've got another tray where I put the super that I'm working on down. Take the frames out one by one. This is my uncapping tray here. And then I've got a bucket with a colander on top, which cappings go into, so they drain off. And then there's another tray here, and super frames go in there once they've been uncapped. A rack is useful there if you've got something just to hold them up a bit. And then when you've got sufficient, they go in the extractor. If you've got an electric extractor, life is lovely because it can be spinning while you're uncapping. Uncapping for me is the log jam. It takes ages. But if you've got an electric extractor, I've got a 9-frame one. You put 9 frames in, that's almost a super worth usually. 9 frames in, set it spinning, and you can be doing the next super while it's spinning. A couple of times turn the speed up a little bit just to keep it going. And after 10, 15, 20 minutes of spinning, most of the honey will have come out. So you take the frames out of that and put them back into a super here, which again is on a tray on the floor. And so the supers get moved across here. The frames go around this way. And when you've dealt with one stack, and they're all over here, they go back out. Your food room needs to have clean surfaces, clean walls, clean ceiling, good lighting, but be able to see what you're doing. You need to have a sink with hot and cold water, and you need to have somewhere to wash your hands. And producing honey, it just gets everywhere, doesn't it? You end up sticky, whatever you do. If there's a toilet nearby, it needs to have 2 doors, so an intervening ventilated space. And you need to have a wash basin near the toilet as well, so that you've got, when you come out of the loo, you wash your hands. And I think the next slide is, so this is Twickenham and Thames Valley. If there's anybody from Twickenham and Thames Valley, this is your honey extracting room. You probably recognize it. I went there when you opened your facility, which is now depressingly 15 or so years ago. And you had this wonderful facility, lovely plastic lined walls, stainless steel work surfaces, a couple of nice big sinks. And this is available for members to borrow or hire and do their extracting in. And the equipment is nice as well. So we've got stainless steel. That's probably a waste bin, I'd imagine, because it's got a plastic bag in it with a lid. There's an extractor there, motorized extractor, food grade plastic. Settling tank, do you think there? Nice stainless steel settling tank. So everything in here is hunky-dory. It looks really good to me. Yeah, that's what you're pitching at. That would be ideal. The kind of thing you don't want to find are things like this. This is the back of a loo door, the lock on the back of a loo door, and hand contact areas. You go to the loo, your hands aren't very clean, and you touch the loo door, and this hasn't been cleaned for quite a long time. This is the door to a kitchen, one of those kitchens where the waiters go in one side and come out the other side. So they barge this door with their elbows or with their hands. This is a hand contact area, and you can see it's really grubby. and that really is actually beyond being cleaned. It needs to be repainted. I always put this slide in. So this is, you need to have some pest control in place. The food safety regulations actually say you must have screens or windows and doors to keep flies out. Anybody who's ever extracted honey in a room that isn't bee type will know that it's important things are bee type. Flies and things can't get in. I think bees would get past that curtain there, but that's the kind of thing that would be available or used in a commercial setting. And this one's just a sort of, these are mouse droppings. They're never a good look in a food room. So you need to have some kind of monitoring, make sure that your room doesn't get mice in it, rats in it, or anything else in it. And if it does, take some actions to prevent it. In fact, have stuff in place. I've got a couple of mouse traps. I live fairly rural, we get mice. I have a couple of mouse traps down in my food room continuously. Domestic premises. If you work from your domestic kitchen, then there are special regulations. They're actually up here, but Zoom has put a little thing across the screen. I can't actually see what it says there. But the domestic premises, much more pragmatic. If your kitchen, normal kitchen, is sort of average, to be honest with you, you're probably going to be working just fine. You need to have appropriate facilities to maintain adequate personal hygiene. So you need to be able to wash your hands somewhere. Exactly what and exactly where, it's open to consideration. I've certainly talked to EHOs who've said, well, as long as they've got a bucket and some soap and some warm water, and I use paper towels, kitchen roll, somewhere to dry their hands, then in a normal domestic kitchen, then that's fine. Surfaces in contact with food must be in sound condition and easy to clean. So surfaces that you're working on, Formica, something like that. Wood probably isn't good enough, but stainless steel, Formica, granite, something of that nature. Normal roll top work surfaces in your kitchen, it can be absolutely fine. You need to have facilities for cleaning, and if you need to, disinfecting utensils and equipment. So a kitchen sink with hot and cold water. I grayed out the bit about cleaning because we don't really do that. Adequate supply of hot and cold potable water, and the potable ones, the ones that cause a bit of a sticking point. I did this talk to Scotland a little while ago, and in Scotland, lots and lots of people aren't on mains water. I've always had the luxury of having mains water supply. I turn on the tap, water comes out. If you live out in a fairly rural area, you may have a borehole or some other private water supply, and so if you do, it needs to meet the water. Private water supply requirements. And Scotland was having quite a discussion. Somebody had asked for quite a high level of testing for the water because it was a food business, and they're wondering whether that was necessary or not. You need to have arrangements for getting rid of waste, and you need to place stuff so avoid the risk of contamination. So just be careful where you put stuff. Storing your buckets of honey in the garden shed probably isn't a good idea. Storing them in the corner of the lounge is probably better, but might not go down well with your partner. We think a little bit about equipment and materials, which is something people don't think about very often. Everything should be food grade. It should ideally be purpose made and from a reputable supplier, someone who you can go back to later. Plastic materials should have a cup and fork symbol. That shows it's food safe, or the words for food use on it. And that again shows it's a food safe plastic. The kind of thing that I still see for sale on eBay and other auction sites are things like this as an old tin plate extractor. Now, tin plate is absolutely brilliant material. Tin itself is very unreactive, and we buy our baked beans in tins. The clue's in the name. They are actually lined with a very thin layer of tin, and it protects the food from the steel behind it. The problem with tin plate extractors, they're probably made about 1920 or 1930 or sometime around then, but you do still see them for sale, and I've certainly seen them being used, is they're jointed with lead-based solder. So Here is a lead soldered seam. This is lead all the way around here, lead across the center. The lug here is soldered in with lead. The whole thing has got quite a lot of lead in it. Now, honey is acidic, so honey will etch and attack lead. So if you use this for extracting honey, then you are getting lead into your food. Probably not to a great extent, but I'd be particularly worried about lead settling or tin plate settling tanks. Again, sort of same vintage as this. Occasionally see them for sale. Okay, so equipment we've dealt with, I think, and we come to food handlers. So this chap, he must have gone down to the Nile for a swim after work, mustn't he? Can you imagine how sticky he was at the end of the day? It gets everywhere, absolutely everywhere. But he's a food handler. And what does a modern food handler need to do? So we need to have a high standard of personal cleanliness. I've certainly known people who I would not want to see being food handlers. Every now and then you come across somebody who had a friend who had probably a personality disorder, but cleanliness wasn't top of his list of priorities. You should be wearing clean and wear appropriate protective clothing, so clean over clothing. This is my friend Annie, who was demonstrating uncapping, and you'll see she's got a nice hat on, keep her hair in place. She's got a pair of gloves. She's got it's a check shirt actually, but she uses it as an overcoat to protect the clothes from the honey, and she's got a pinny on, and she's a really well-equipped food handler. I didn't ask her, but I like to think she wasn't suffering from a foodborne disease. If you are suffering from foodborne disease, you must, so in other words, diarrhea or vomiting, you mustn't work until at least 48 hours after the symptoms have cleared up. And there's a very good reason for that. We'll come to that in a moment. And you should be trained and supervised. So a lot of beekeepers work by themselves. They work on their own. We are our own bosses. How are we supervised? And we're not really. But if you're trained, then what does training mean? Well, this counts as training. You can put down, I listened to Andy Pedley giving a talk on food safety beekeepers, and this counts as training. You won't get any certificate for this one, for which apologies. It becomes too complicated on Zoom and YouTube and things. But often if I'm doing this in person, then halfway through I hand out certificates to people who are there to say they've been there, just a little certificate saying this person has had some training on food safety. And that will please any inspector who comes along. There are formal food safety courses, and if you Google online, you'll find very quickly that food safety courses, they're not very expensive, about £20, £25, something like that. Make sure it's an accredited one. It takes a few hours to go through. There's a little assessment at the end. And at the end of it, they will email you or send you some kind of certificate. And you may well find that your local authority also runs them, or there are other suppliers locally. The level 2 catering is generally recommended to be about right for beekeepers. There's this little booklet here, which is a free download, and there's a QR code and a tiny URL for it as well. So if you want to download this, it's a good not a good read. It's a useful read. You don't need to memorize it. Have a quick browse through, familiarize yourself with it, and it tells you what's expected of food handlers. Now, I mentioned 24 hours after, or 48 hours after being infected, for diarrhea and vomiting clearing up. And E. coli is very topical at the moment, being a lot about it in the news. Well, this poor lady had a kebab, doner kebab, and the people who prepared the doner kebab hadn't been very good. They presumably had diarrhea and vomiting. They had been working, they hadn't cleaned their hands very well. They hadn't heated the doner kebab up sufficiently to kill the bacteria. Lizzie Jordan bought and ate this doner kebab, and she is now blind, and it's a very unpleasant illness. So that's one of a number of food poisoning illnesses that we need to be aware of. It's quite a sobering thought. People ask me about cleaning. So this is Cleopatra, and she's not about to hop into a nice bath of ass's milk here. She is, in fact, a beekeeper. People don't know this of Cleopatra. And this bath contains all her equipment for extracting and processing her honey. And she's got a nice lot of soapy water in it. No doubt her slaves have made it nice and hot. And she's got brushes here. She's got everything, a really nice good scrub, and get everything nice and clean and let it dry very well. Maybe I'm being a bit fanciful here, but it's a useful illustration because it kind of does go, all right, so how do we clean? And if we're washing equipment, I always wash everything that comes into contact with the food. So my honey buckets get washed inside and out before I use them. My uncapping fork, my uncapping knife, and so on get washed. My strainers get washed. The jars, of course, get washed and rinsed out, and the lids get washed and rinsed out. So everything is nice and clean. The extractor gets washed out very thoroughly. And then when it's all completed, it gets washed and put away. Hot water to wash. We all probably know that if you wash something that's got wax in it with hot water, then the wax will melt and stick on the side and it becomes a nuisance. So a quick rinse with cold water just to get the honey and the wax out, then hot water, give it a good wash around. In terms of a detergent, something like washing up liquid is absolutely fine. Food safe wash detergent, a sanitizer of some kind. So something that is slightly antibacterial as well is also good. You don't need to sterilize anything. Often, occasionally, I'm asked, how do you sterilize your jars? And I don't, and there's no need to. People say, oh, but I've been told I must. Honey is not jam. If you put jam into jars that haven't been sterilized, then it will go moldy. If you put honey into jars that haven't been sterilized, it doesn't matter. We've got those 3 antibacterial qualities of honey. It's acidic. It's got a very high osmotic pressure because it's got so much sugar in it. Oh, excuse me. And it contains hydrogen peroxide. So there are 3 antibacterial actions occur. And so long as it's ripe, it will not deteriorate. If it's not quite ripe, then it ferments, and we know what happens then. So that's all you need to do with washing. I like to make sure things are very dry. Again, water, if there's water, residual water, it's going to get into the honey. So I let things drain and air dry until everything's absolutely dry. So typically, if I'm doing some bucketing, putting jars of honey up, I'll wash the jars and give them 24 hours to dry, and make sure that they are properly dry before I start packing the honey into them. Strainers. So the strainers, often we're using cloth. This is a cone filter that is available. I've actually stopped using this now because it just got clogged too quickly. But strainers need to be food grade, and all sorts of things I've seen being mentioned as being suitable for straining. And if you're using a plastic strainer, it should be food grade. And if you're using something like a nylon cloth, then make sure it's been bought as a food straining material. The reason I say that, I've seen things like net curtains being used and advocated, oh, pop down the local shop and get a bit of net curtain, use that. Lovely fine strainer. Well, it's not food grade, so it shouldn't be being used. You don't know what's being attacked, sort of chemicals being put into it that could leach into your food. The other thing is when you come to wash them, you don't pop them in the laundry with that old loincloth that I mentioned earlier. You rinse them out with your food safe detergent in the sink, and once they're clean, let them dry and then pop them away. Again, sort of things like washing powder contain all sorts of chemicals that really shouldn't be getting into your food. These are the honey regulations. I've got the Scottish ones here because I gave this talk to Scotland a little while ago and I haven't swapped them back. So the honey regulations 2015. And this is where things like descriptions come in, and definitions of honey, that kind of thing, and particular qualities and different quantities of honey. Key points are that there are things called reserved descriptions. So we're allowed to call honey drained honey or extracted honey or comb honey, things of that nature. We can give it a floral description. So if we know it came from oilseed rape, predominantly oilseed rape, you can call it oilseed rape honey. You can give it geographical location, geographical description. So if it's from Oxfordshire, then you can call it Oxfordshire honey. I've got hives in a place called Oddington, so I label mine as Oddington honey, but then I have to be careful that I actually keep the honey that's come from Oddington separate from the ones that have come from elsewhere. And it's a bit, there's arguments about this, there's interpretation as always. One of the questions I've been asked is it okay to give it a geographical location when the bees might have flown out of that area? So Oddington, they might have flown over as far as Charlton or Knockmore. Can I still call it Oddington honey? I don't know. I think it would probably be okay. It's where I always call it where the hives are, and that seems to be okay. But it depends a bit on how detailed you get into on the definitions. The honey regulations define the composition, so it should have 20% water or less, and 80% sugar or more. But there's a thing called baker's honey, which is an inferior grade honey. It can have slightly higher water content. And heather honey can have also a slightly higher water content. There's stuff about the water insoluble content and electrical conductivity, about which I don't deal. And then finally, there's some requirements on the HMF and the diastase activity. And these are measures of the heating that the honey is being subject to and the time it's been stored. What everybody gets hung up on is the HMF, but in fact the diastase, the enzyme activity reduces much faster than the HMF increases. So that's the one that I use to set my best before date. The only monitoring that I can do as a beekeeper when I'm extracting honey is to use a refractometer. This little gadget here. There's a plate here that lifts up, and you put a drop of honey on there, and it really does only need to be a drop of honey. You pop the plate down, hold it up to the light and peer through it, and you get a reading on a scale. This is very, very unclear, this. It's very hard to get a photograph through these things. I've tried a number of times and it just doesn't work. But what you really want is the blue line to be, that's the 80 mark. So you want the blue line to be there or above. And then 20% water is about there. So sort of above there, anything in that region is okay. It's a fairly crude measure, but it's very simple. These things are 25 quid or so. So I've had mine for probably 15 or 20 years, so it doesn't owe me very much. I talked about HMF, and we get very hung up on HMF. So there's a number of sources on the internet where people have done research, scientists have done research and measured HMF over time. So this is from a reputable source. This is a European symposium. HMF formation at 50 degrees centigrade. Now I heat my honey to 42 degrees centigrade. That's enough to liquefy oilseed rape. I know other people heat the honey to 38, and that's generally enough. I didn't get it completely liquefied at 38, so I push up to 42. But if you look, these are 4 different kinds of honey. Chestnut is the red one, absolutely no increase. And this is after 144 hours of heating. Most of them actually go down after 48 hours, which is a bit inexplicable, and then gradually they ascend. Now, the legal limit is 40 milligrams per kilogram. So the legal limit is up here. And after 144 hours at 50 degrees centigrade, they haven't increased to the legal limit. Now, there's probably a bit of a baseline of HMF before it gets in there, but we do get anxious about HMF, and it's not something that I think we need to worry about in terms of our heating, as long as you're not daft about it. I put it in the warming cabinet, set the thermostat for 42 degrees, and try to get back to it 24 hours later, which is usually enough to have melted a bucket of honey out. Occasionally I forget, might be a bit longer, but at the moment I'm in the groove of extracting and processing honey, so 48 hours is fine. So we think a little bit about jars. As you're washing things, you need to inspect them, just make sure they're okay. This one had an inclusion in the glass, and it caused the glass to crack. So I picked that up as I was washing the jar out. You can see a soap bubble in the corner there. So that one was obviously a reject. It's the only jar I've ever had that was rejected or had to reject because of a fault in the glass. This one had a hole in the bottom. Picked that up again when I was washing it. And I think probably the couriers had dropped the box or something, managed to knock a hole in one jar. This one's a bit more interesting. This is recycled glass, and it's got a cork stopper. And I looked at it and thought, oh, that's really nice, really great with honey in it. Gave it to a friend, filled it with honey, gave it to a friend. And a few weeks later, Sue came back to me and said, that honey you gave me has made a horrible mess on my shelf. What happened? The cork stopper wasn't airtight. Moisture was absorbed through the cork stopper. The honey had become a bit more dilute. It had started to ferment because it got down below that 80% water content, sugar content. When it ferments, it bubbles, it oozes over the top, and made a right old mess. And the other question is, was it actually sold as a food grade jar at all? It was recycled glass. What was in the glass, and was it actually a food jar or just something ornamental? I don't know. Labeling is always a big one. The only question I got off the sort of canvas I put out on Facebook was about labeling. So there are 6 requirements on labeling. You need to have the name of the food: honey, extracted honey, Oddington honey, oilseed rape honey, whatever. Those are all okay. You need to have the weight, and that must be in metric. You can have the imperial weight as well, but it must be secondary. It must be more prominent. It must be afterwards. And for up to a kilo package, so a kilo of honey, it would be 5 millimeters height for the script. You need to have the name and address of the packer. So I pack my own honey, but if I took the honey around the corner to a friend who loves packing honey, it becomes the name and address of the person who's actually packed it. Change of responsibility there. Country of origin, so product England or product to the UK, needs to have a batch number. People get very confused about batch numbers, so we'll talk about that a bit at the end, a bit later. Best before date, and people go, oh, honey never goes off. It deteriorates. You can't see it deteriorate. The diastase decreases. And so the science behind it is roughly 2 years as a maximum. There was a talk by the government chemist, a webinar by the government chemist a year or 2 ago, specifically on honey. And the government chemist said he thought 2 years was reasonable. And you won't get much higher than that. I'm not going to argue with that. I found some research online, and 18 months to 2 years was thought to be a reasonable best before date. Optionally, you can put a botulism warning. Honey must not be given to infants under 12 months. Optionally, you can put storage instructions, so store with the lid tight, and in a cool, dry place or something like that. And then for compound foods, if you're producing honey fudge or something like that, and we'll be talking a bit more about that presently, but you need to have ingredients and allergens as well. There are other labelling regulations, but most of them would apply to larger outfits than beekeepers. So we'll talk about compound foods. So some beekeepers add value, or you use that second quality honey to do something with it and get value added out of it. So you make honey cake or honey biscuits or honey fudge. Infusions are a thing now: honey with cinnamon, or honey with nutmeg, honey with garlic, honey with nuts, honey mustard, and honey marmalade are all things I know people produce. Now, one thing is you need to register as a food business the moment you start producing compound foods. The labelling requirements do become more complicated as well. So you've then got to have your list of ingredients, and you have got to have, if there are any allergens in it, the allergens. So honey with nuts, you'd need to specify what kind of nuts are in the ingredients list. Honey itself, you don't need to worry about the ingredients at all. It is a single ingredient food. Honey is honey. If you are producing compound foods, the allergens need to be emphasized. So they need to be in bold or italics or a bigger font or something like that. They need to be really clear that there's allergens in there. You may need to make what's known as a quantitative ingredients declaration, or a QID. So if you're selling honey with nuts, okay, how much honey and how much nuts? 50% honey, 50% nuts, whatever. So you might need to make that. You may need to make a list of ingredients of ingredients. So if you're producing honey cake and you're using flour, the flour will have ingredients, and you need to list those as well. You get them off the packet with flour. Do check your insurance. The BBK insurance does not cover you for compound foods. Legally, you must register as a food business. You need to keep records. You need to keep a back sheet. So I baked 10 honey cakes this afternoon. This is my recipe. This is where I bought the ingredients from. Here are the receipts for the ingredients. Here are the batch numbers for the ingredients. You need to keep that kind of detail. And you will need to have a durability date. So how long does this product keep for? I had an inquiry actually by the BBKA. Somebody has challenged on the durability date of their honey. But if you produce honey mustard, how do you know how long that's going to keep for? Do you need to keep it in the fridge? Well, I don't know. I don't know what the answers are. But if you're producing those foods, then you need to be aware of that. This is a list of allergens. I won't go into it now. This is all on the Food Standards Agency website. If you're producing compound foods and you're putting allergens in, you must list them. And you need to keep records. So I mentioned a batch sheet. When I'm doing honey, I've got a batch sheet which I use. It's got far more spaces I ever fill in. It includes things like when I took the super off the where it was stored, how long it's stored for, the date I extracted it, the date I bottled it, check weights and things like that. So I keep a lot of information. I particularly keep information about how long it's heated for, and also the weights. There's a bit. I've done an article for BBK News on weights and measures, which will be coming out, I think, quite soon. That's a whole area by itself that we need to worry about. And again, I've never actually seen anything about it on in any Beecraft or anything like that, BBK News, anything like that on weights. So that's an interesting one. In particular, you must keep a record of veterinary medicines. And I mentioned weights already, and allergens, very, very important. It's up to you what you keep the records of, but if something goes wrong, it's worth keeping a note. Look back, oh, the straining cloth burst. Buy a new straining cloth, make sure I use it better, that kind of thing. If you're working in a domestic kitchen and you have peanuts or muesli or something like that, is there a risk of cross-contamination between your honey and your other stuff in your kitchen, even peanuts that feed the birds? And there's a thing called precautionary allergen labelling. So you need to do some kind of risk assessment. I'm producing this food. Is it possible it's contaminated? It has cross-contamination with something else? Maybe I use a strainer or a sieve, and it's been used for something that contains an allergen. Is that going to be a serious risk? And if you you might need to put a precautionary allergen label on. This actually was a question that was asked when a London EHO did a food safety course for some beekeepers in London. Now, to sort of reassure you, I don't think anybody has ever had any kind of allergic reaction to anything they've got in honey. So I think we're fairly safe, but I put it in as a thought. This is why this stuff's important. This is Celia Marsh, who died because she went to Pret a Manger. She bought a vegan wrap because she thought vegan wrap would be free from dairy. She had an unbelievable sensitivity to dairy. She ate it and she died. And the manufacturer of the dairy-free yogurt had in its possession documentation that flagged this risk, but it was not passed on to its customers. And that's from the Daily Mail. Very, very sad story. This is the kind of thing that you need to be aware of. So one of the questions I'm often asked is, do I need to register or not? And all food businesses need to register, period. The butcher, the baker, the pub across the road, Sainsbury's, they are all registered as food businesses. And on the front door, usually you'll find a little plaque, a little sticker saying this business is registered, and its star rating, which is really good. Food safety rating. But there's an exclusion for beekeepers, and the first one is it's an exclusion for prime producers. And are you producing a prime product? For beekeepers, there's a very specific bit of guidance. So honey is a prime product. In fact, all products of the hive are prime products. So if you're just producing and selling honey, pollen, royal jelly, propolis, and wax probably not going for food, but sometimes it does. That is a prime product, and you don't need to register. But then, is it processed in your own premises? So in your domestic kitchen or in your home or whatever, is it processed in your own premises? Are you only producing small quantities? And there is no legal definition of small. I spoke to a Welsh beekeeper, a Welsh EHO, whose hubby was a beekeeper, and she does a lot of food safety for beekeepers and honey production over in Wales. So she's obviously got a lot of experience. And she thought small quantities was up to 250 to 300 pounds of honey. That's what she thought was a reasonable sort of small quantity guidance, but there's nothing in law about that at all. And then the last one, do you do direct sales? So I sell it to my friends, I sell it at my gate, I go to a church fete and sell it at the church fete, I sell it at the local village gala, I might go to a craft fair at Christmas and sell it there. Those are all direct sales. And I can sell it through a local retailer. So I mentioned the sweet shop earlier, and they have local honey for sale. So I can sell it through that. And I'm still in this prime produce zone, and I don't need to register. But if I start producing any product that is from honey, so I'm producing honey beer or cakes or fudge or anything like that, then immediately I need to register. If I take it to a friend's house or go to an association place or a co-op processes it, then it needs to be, I need to register. If I'm producing large quantities, I've mentioned the absence of a definition, or if I'm using indirect or bulk sales. The Welsh beekeeper, Welsh EHO, incidentally thought 30 miles was local. I would disagree with that, but there is a legal precedent she was basing that on. I won't go into the detail of that. I knew of it, but I would say local's like 4 miles, 5 miles, something like that. But again, you can play with that one endlessly. Registration considerations, it is an offence not to register if you are supposed to. You might think you're exempt because you only produce small quantities. We all start off small scale, and then we get more time, or we suddenly find we've got 5 hives instead of 3. We get more honey. Have we got past the small scale thing? We start making foods, compound foods, and the Welsh beekeeper, Welsh EHO, pointed out that some venues require a food safety rating before they'll let you have a stall at an event. So you might need to have a food safety rating. And if you need to have a food safety rating, you need to register to get that. So primary production, that lady thought most, sort of 70% of beekeepers didn't need to register. They accept that honey is a very low risk food. It's very seasonal. I mean, sometimes people just extract for 1 or 2 days. It's small scale, and I mentioned 250 pounds and 30 miles. But you always need to register if it's business to business sales, buckets of honey. if it's compound foods, if it's extracted other than at your own premises, if your honey room is used by others, or if you're doing distance selling, mail order, that kind of thing, you're going to need to register. And the advice is, if in doubt, pop your local authority a quick email. If it's your local authority you register with, and you'll find the food section on their website. Dear EHOs, I'm a beekeeper. I've got 5 hives I produced last year. I produced 200 pounds of honey. I would sell it all locally. Do I need to register? ? And they'll come back to you. They'll probably phone you up and have a chat and be fascinated. And the answer might well be no, you don't, or you might want to be. But it opens, first of all, it opens a dialogue with them. And secondly, if they go into a shop and they find that they find a jar of honey, and it says on the jar of honey, "Oh, Andy Pedley's honey," and they go, "Oh," and they get the computer out, type away Andy Pedley beekeeper, and they find I'm not registered, they might go, "Why isn't Andy registered?" and come knocking on my door. On the other hand, if I've had a dialogue with them, they type on the computer and go, "Oh, that's that bloke who emailed us last year, he's fine." And if one of your customers complains something's wrong with your honey, and they know you're a beekeeper, you're there, they'll phone you up and say, "Mr. Pedley, we've had a problem with your honey. It's gone bubbly in the jar. Have you got any ideas?" Well, if they don't know you, they'll be knocking on the door again, and they might not be, they might be a little bit more suspicious. So I mentioned food hygiene rating. So this is what you get if you are inspected. I've got an awaiting inspection certificate, which I've had for the last 4.5 years now. They obviously don't think I'm very important. So this one is generally satisfactory. That's good, and that's very good. So 3, 4, and 5 are what you're pitching at. When I was inspected at my previous local authority, I got a 5, and I was really chuffed. So what could spoil our honey? Well, I've kind of worked through this, haven't I? Hopefully. Water, medications, pesticides, preservatives, propolis, dirt. I've gone all the way through and told you everything that could spoil your honey and some of the solutions. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? And how do you put all that into practice? So you have a thing called a HACCP document. So this is my HACCP. It's the first page of a 4-pager, actually. So it starts off, what's the hazard? What could be wrong with the honey? And the first one is contamination. Where could it happen? The hive. So contamination could occur at the hive. What's type of contamination? It could be chemical. What sort of chemical? Preservatives. What's the critical limit? You're not allowed any. So I make sure that the woodbug at the hive is treated with non-toxic, odor-free treatments. Nice and straightforward. Chemical veterinary medicines. What's the critical limit? Nil. So I only use approved medications. I fully comply with the treatment regime. If necessary, I mark the supers so they can be set aside. That's an oxytetracycline thing. If I had that situation, I'd make sure that super was extracted last. It's very theoretical. I label buckets so I can keep track of things, and so on. So this is my HACCP. It's in the book. There is this, and I used to sort of gloss over it, but actually it's really useful, particularly for doing compound foods. This is a free download from the Food Standards Agency. There's a URL there for it, but if you just cites Google Safer Food, Better Business, or even SFBB, you'll probably find this. And there's a series of checklists. You go through them, and some of them won't be relevant, but some of them will be relevant and useful. And you go through it, tick them all off, and that will help you a lot, and particularly larger scale, or as I say, people producing compound foods. So that's the end. Thank you for listening. Here are those codes again. So this is for the book. If you click on that, it will take you through to my book. And the handout is here, or scan that QR code. And that one, I think, is the one for the food business, food handlers guidance there. So some useful things. We'll leave that on screen, shall we? and I'm hoping that somebody's there still.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. That's absolutely.
That's okay. I've lost the people, so it gets a bit dry after a while. Ooh, have I lost the screen? Should we go back up? Let's go.
I will put the links on the web page.
Yes, please.
I'll share them below the video on YouTube as
Oh,
well.
there's a lot of you there. Gosh.
Yes, we've got quite a few people. Are
Yeah,
there any
84.
questions?
Great.
If you'd like to put your hand up and unmute, and that's the option button. Lucy.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. I've been to your workshops before, but it's always really good to hear this. We can't hear it often enough. I'm afraid I had to miss the beginning, and I was wondering whether there is any requirement when we extract or when we jar to kind of cover things. If we have washable surfaces in a kitchen, in a domestic kitchen, is there any further requirement to kind of cover things with plastic or with anything, whether it's floor or surfaces?
No, there's no requirement. So if your work surfaces are sort of the normal stuff you see in wicks and so on, Formica type surfaces, that kind of thing, they're absolutely fine. One of the pictures that appeared on the Facebook pages, everything seemed to have been covered with aluminium foil. I'm not honestly sure where that came from. It wasn't from me, I'll tell you that. I just looked at that and thought, well, somebody's probably trying to protect the work surfaces from propolis and so on, which is actually a consideration. I've got a lovely white work surface. I put a super down on it, and the propolis immediately etched its way into the white Formica, and it's permanently stained now. I'm really quite cross about it. So I do put something down more to protect the work surfaces than to protect honey. But if you've got stuff that's readily cleansable, you don't need to cover it at all. The floor is an interesting one because I was always told, and I've been keeping bees for 30-something years, and I could cast my mind back, and a friend gave me instructions, demonstrated extracting to me. So get newspaper, he says, and you cover the floor in newspaper, and then if a drop of honey goes on the floor, cover that drop of honey with another sheet of newspaper. Then at the end of it, you roll the newspaper up and chuck it all out, and you haven't got honey all over your floor. And good advice. You should have readily cleansable floor covering of some kind, tiles or lino or vinyl or something like that. But we all know that if you get bits of wax on the floor and you tread on them, it's like armor plating, isn't it? That with chisel, and try to clean the stuff off. So it is actually quite a good idea to cover the floor with something. And these days, newspaper you can't hardly get hold of. But Amazon provide an awful lot of cardboard boxes, so I use cardboard boxes and then chuck it away again afterwards.
So if we did use a floor covering, that itself wouldn't have to be food grade?
Sorry,
if we did cover the floor with something to protect it, that covering wouldn't have to be washable or food grade?
Well, I don't think so. The food isn't going to go and contact the floor, is it?
Well, we're not going to use it when it does, yeah.
Yeah, well, you're not going to straight scoop it up off the floor. Do you remember one of the slides I showed was it was that underneath the extractor, it got a strainer in it, in the bucket, and it was the thing was standing in a plastic tray, and I'd had spillage into the plastic tray. Well, the plastic tray isn't a food grade tray, so when that happens to me, that honey doesn't go into the food
chain. Okay,
it gets set aside. It doesn't go into the food chain. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I cover the floor simply as a practical to make sure that the floor gets, this isn't too dreadful at the end.
Okay. Good. Thank you. That's
okay. You're welcome.
Are there any other questions? Oh, Rebecca.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks so much, Andy. That was really, really interesting. So I'm just, your lovely flow chart of whether you need to register or not.
Yeah.
So I have my own apiary here on my farm, and that kind of all makes sense because it's literally a short walk, and it's all being processed in my own room.
Yep.
But I've recently taken on a small apiary 10 miles away for a lady who has land but doesn't want to beekeep. But I just need to clarify that actually, if I am the beekeeper of those bees and then bringing the honey back to mine, it should be my name on the label, and B, I should then be registered.
Yeah,
for
well,
food safety.
yeah. So it should be your name on the label, but so it's honey from somebody else's apiary that you're processing.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it should be your name on the label, but you'll be keeping a back sheet that said it is Lucy's honey.
Yes.
Yeah. And yeah, I think you'd need to register for that. But
Yeah.
I've got a sneaking suspicion if you contacted your local authority, explain the circumstances, they would probably say to you, yeah, don't worry too much.
Okay. So
yeah.
like you said, best thing just to
But
look into it.
Legally, what the guidance says is it's produce of your own hives. Now, if you took over that apiary 10 miles away and you managed it, and so the honey was all yours, then you wouldn't need to register.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
It's a fine legal point. I've never seen a kind of, I think the EHO in Wales have picked up on it. She did admit that she'd listened to me talking to a Welsh Beekeepers Convention webinar 18 months before, and I think she had found stuff out that she didn't know.
I think they're like you've shown the example there with other food. It's about that traceability, isn't it? If that other apiary's honey is goes to their local church and their local silk mill, there just has to be that traceability, doesn't there? That's the main thing. Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We do have a couple of questions that have been asked in the chat.
Yep.
What about reusing jars and lids?
So reusing.
Yeah.
All right. So the official advice from the Food Standards Agency is thou shalt not recycle jars and lids. It was issued in, I think, 2012, and it was reissued probably about 2015, 16. It's something beekeepers get quite anxious about and get actually quite cross about, to be honest with you. I have a milkman who comes around and drops me off a milk bottle or two twice a week, and I put the bottle out and it goes back and it's recycled. And I've had them that have been back through the factory so often they've got visual, almost opaque glass because they've been jogging around through the factory. They must have been in and out of the factory 20, 30 times. But the Foods Agency said you mustn't reuse jars, and they didn't explain why you shouldn't. So the official advice is you don't. It's about risk management. What is the risk? And if they kind of backed off a little bit after, because they got into a bit of trouble for this. It was, people couldn't see the point, and they hadn't explained it. So they said, well, the milkman, it's a closed loop. The bottle goes out to the customers and back to the dairy, and the dairy have got commercial washing equipment. So, I think they called it a closed loop or something like that. But if one of your customers offers you your jar back, can you then, is it a closed loop? But it becomes very complicated. There are a couple of legal reasons why you shouldn't. But in practice, I can't see a problem with it. But as I say, officially, the advice is no, you can't reuse your jars.
Thank you. Adam's got his hand up, and then Gerard has got a question as well.
Yep.
Hello,
Hi, Adam.
Hello.
Only just. You're a bit quiet, Adam.
Yep.
Okay, apologies for that.
Well, that's better.
Is that better, is it? Okay. Thank you, Andy, for the presentation so far. I'm guessing that this is in relation more to the Food Standards Agency, but if you have to register, like as what you said with the flow chart, do you also have to register with trading standards as well?
No, so they usually work together, but you register with the local authority of the food business. Trading standards, there's no registration requirement. They will often sort of know of you from trading standards. So when I moved out to Oxford 4.5 years ago. I registered with the local authority, which is Cherwell District Council, and I got an email back from them saying, "You're a beekeeper, you don't need to register." To which I didn't reply, going, "I'm a retired EHO, I know more than you do." But they said, "But we'll pass your information on to trading standards because they may well come and talk about labelling." And there's this funny split. I've never quite got my head around it, even though I've worked in local government for something like 50 years. That trading standards do labelling, but sometimes environmental health do labelling. I've always thought labelling is far more an environmental health matter than a trading standards matter. I've been in correspondence with the local trading standards people quite a lot because they helped me a lot with the article that's coming out in Beecraft, and corrected a number of mistakes that I've made, and just help, as I say, help me a lot. And they don't seem to be sort of anxious. They know beekeepers are out there and appreciate the fact that I'm doing something that educates people and help you know what the legal requirements are. But no need to register with trading standards.
Right, thank you. Gerard, do you want to ask your question? Gerard?
Yes, hello. I would like to know more about the botulism contamination. How does that happen? And,
All right,
is it an issue?
It isn't an issue so long as people are aware of it. So botulism is it's a spore-forming organism and it's present in soil. It's very, very common. It's also a very, very stable spore. And you've probably heard of incidents of botulism occurring. And it's usually associated with tinned meat or tinned salmon or something like that has been cooked through properly. And if you tin any product, it's actually put through a thing called the botulism cook, which takes it up to 120 degrees centigrade, which is sufficient to kill the spores because the spores are incredibly heat resistant. So botulism isn't generally a problem. Occasionally it does occur. But the particular hazard is that botulism spores can be present in honey, and it just occurs naturally, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you sample my honey now, you'll very possibly find botulism spores in it, even though I've done everything that I possibly can to handle it properly all the way through. Now, if I eat the honey, the botulism does me no harm at all. But if you give the honey to an infant, somebody who's under 12 months old, their microbiome, their gut microbiome, hasn't developed. So this is the people who, the children who you're still sterilizing their milk bottles and so on before you give them stuff. And the conditions in their intestines are such that the botulism can germinate and reproduce. And it produces a thing called, it produces the botulism toxin, which is very unpleasant indeed. And it produces a disease called the floppy baby syndrome. It's a neurotoxin and they go floppy. They lose their motor movement. It's a serious illness. In the UK, it's very rare. And I think it has to do with the fact that we do put on our labels, or commercially people put on their labels, shouldn't be given to children under 12 months. In the USA, it's actually a much bigger thing. They have many more cases. And I missed the trick because I did a webinar to the USA last month. And I forgot to mention this, but they have like 100 cases a year, which is phenomenal. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know the detail of the disease. There is now a serum, an antitoxin that can be given and helps. But my daughter worked for Great Ormond Street, and they had a baby with floppy baby syndrome come in, and she said it wasn't good to see this child at all. So it's something to be avoided. And so that little label, little line on the thing, I think it's just well worth putting on.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Steve. you've got your hand up if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for this chat, and thanks to this.
Snap.
Your book.
I got one of those too.
Yeah. Thanks to that, I got my 5-star rated a few weeks ago, as Diane will verify. The question. Oh, look, Diane's got one as well. I've got my bloody question now. I forget it.
Okay, well, if you think, come back. I'm sure Diane will let you. But thank you for the praise for the book. It's been very well received, I must say. You launch something like that, and it's like, you know, am I going to get pilloried, or is it going to go down well? And it's been gone down really, really well.
Yeah.
Well, I was grateful for it. I got my 5-star rating with it, and I'm quite happy with that.
Good.
Lucy's got another question, but I'm going to read one from the chat. Kate has a question about the labelling of honey. How is an address change tackled if moving either locally or to another county, for example?
Yeah, so that's a really tricky one. Before I moved moved into Oxford, I was living in West London, and I had hives in my daughter's garden, which was in Oxfordshire, and so we kind of, how do I label this honey? You know, I could identify it as being Oxfordshire honey, but what was local? I'm not sure this is the question, actually. Sorry, could you repeat the question? Go
on. How is an address change tackled if moving either locally or to another county?
Oh, I just have to put
she means the address label.
Yeah, so you just have to put your current address on. So you've lost that contact of, you know, I was in Greenford and now I'm in Kittlington. So if somebody had a problem with my honey that I produced in Greenford, they're going to have to do a bit of detective work. But you just have to put your new address on wherever you are currently. Some people move around quite a lot, don't they?
Yes, I believe they do. Lucy, do you want to come in with your question?
Yes, it was related to the one about botulism, and because you mentioned E. coli during your talk, and it's very topical at the moment. Am I right in thinking that E. coli couldn't live in honey?
I'm not a microbiologist, so I honestly don't know. But if you have any foodborne disease, in other words, the symptoms are diarrhea or vomiting, you must not work for 48 hours, regardless of what the disease is. The microbiology of honey and the microbiology of E. coli, I don't know. I think the current outbreak, what they're looking at is, they seem to at the moment to be thinking it's lettuce or something like that that's been washed in dirty water or grown in dirty water. And you're thinking, water authorities are doing an awful lot of putting sewage into rivers at the moment. And I'm putting 2 and 2 together. I'm probably coming up with 528. But you think, is this the cause? Is there a connection?
Thanks. Steve, have you come up with your question yet?
No. Never mind, Steve.
Never mind. I will just say, when my bees find water on the allotment, they are known to go on the dregs of water that come out of the muck pile.
Yeah.
Because it's dark, I assume it warms up nice and quickly in a bit of sunshine.
And it's got nice nutrients in it too, hasn't it? It's got, you know.
Well, it does the plants good.
This is one of those things I've heard it talked about, and I think it was Pam Hunter was saying that the proventriculus in the bee's stomach is so fine that when they're getting stuff, it actually picks out the bacteria. I don't know if that's true or not, but I remember I was told of that. So yeah, they go to absolutely filthy water sources, cow pats and all sorts of things. And you think, oh, how does that happen? And what's that doing to the honey? It doesn't seem to matter.
No, there is another question in the chat. Can you put an email contact on your label rather than your address? Because some beekeepers worry about hives being stolen.
Well, no, is the short answer. you must have a name and an address. The address can be abbreviated down. So my old address was 36 Ferryby Gardens, Greenford, UB69NF. I could just put 36 UB69NF, and that would get through to me. But it has to be something. If you write it on an envelope, put a stamp in the top right-hand corner, put it in the post, it will arrive. You can put additional information, but you must have a postal address.
Thank you. Rebecca's got a question.
I'm sorry, it's me again.
Sorry,
you mentioned in your chat briefly batch numbers, and I thought.
Oh, and I then didn't expand on it. Okay. So yeah, so batch numbers. And you're a good case because you're going to have honey from your 10-mile away one and honey from your own apiary. So immediately you've got 2 batches. Okay. And so I forgot to draw attention to it, but when I showed the picture of the car boot, the supers have got numbers written on them, R5, R6. So I could identify R5 came from the rectory apiary, and it was hive number 5. And if it got P on it, it would be Perivale apiary. And if it got A on it, it was down at Heathrow, a thing called the air plot. So I could identify which apiary the super came from. You might have a spring harvest and a summer harvest. So you might think, okay, so I'm going to have a batch that's spring from the rectory, for the sake of argument, and then a spring from Perivale, and then a summer from the airfield. And so those become your batches, but you might want to make it finer than that. So you might, so spring and summer, different apiaries, I can actually identify back to a hive which super the batch came from. It's a bit laborious, but I print labels on my home computer. So I just print 25 labels with this batch on or whatever. If you've got one apiary and you do one extraction, you've got one batch in a year. If you've got 2 apiaries you want to identify them separately, you might have reasons for doing that. So you might want to be selling your honey from your farm in your farm shop. So what you want to be able to identify is that this is honey that came from my farm, and my honey from my 10-mile away apiary, I know which is which. So you use your batch numbers to identify that.
Okay.
Batch numbers are there to help you. And people get very confused by them. Why do I have to batch number? If you've only got one hive, one apiary, or a few apiaries, and you only do one crop, you've got one batch. You might want to do it. I did this batch on Tuesday, this batch on Wednesday, this batch on Thursday. If you've got, honey farmers are producing, they have extractors that take 30 or 40 frames at a time. Well, they're going to have a different batch system from what I have with my 9-frame extractor.
And they can go like on the bottom of the jar as well, can't they? They don't have to go on like
as long as it's clear where it is, as long as it's legible. I think the rules say that the X height should be 1.2 millimeters generally. So the height of the lettering should be at 1.2 millimeters, which isn't very big. But as long as it's somewhere on the jar, if you look at something like a Coke bottle, Coca-Cola bottle, you'll spend quite a long time looking for the batch number on that. And I think they now use a laser, and they use the laser to burn into the plastic. And you look round, and it's not ink, it's not discolored, but when you get the light on it, you can see the batch number. And it's usually at the top on the, sort of fairly close to the top. But so long as it's there and it's legible, it's okay.
Okay, brilliant.
So, 2 things that need to be in the same view. I got that the right way around. The name of the food and the weight must be in the same view. Everything else could be any way you like.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Right. Thank you very much, Andy. That was absolutely fascinating and very, very useful for those of us with slightly heavy supers at the moment.
I've got one hive with three supers on it, which are full, and all the rest have got nothing. I think it's just been robbing the neighbours.
Right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. So thank you, Andy.
Very silent round of applause, but I'll take it as read.
Yeah,
Thank you
they're
very
all
much
on
indeed.
mute to behave.
Thank you.
Thank you for your attention, everybody.
Thanks a lot,
Really,
Andy.
really
I
work.
hope it was useful.
It was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.